Hello, I'm going to talk a little bit today about the American executive branch. This is going to be a really basic overview, and then I'm going to go into more detail in later videos about some of the specific things that I'm going to talk about. So today is really just going to be executive branch basics. Now, one of the first things, of course, you have to understand is the structure of the executive branch is entirely based around the person of the president. So the president is the sole executive. But then behind the president, of course, we have the vice president who's really only has two jobs. One, they are the president of the Senate, which means they break tie votes, which has been much more necessary in the last 15 to 20 years than in the decades leading up to it. And then two, they're there to step into the president's shoes should the president die in office. And we've had quite a number of presidents die in office. So this has been very important. And then there's the cabinet. So the cabinet are the heads of all of the important agencies. So think Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, Foreign Affairs, the Treasury, so on and so forth. So every single one of those agencies has a cabinet secretary. And I'll be talking about them in more detail later on. And then they run their executive department. So obviously, the president is one person. They can't do everything that needs to be done in the United States government. Instead, what ends up happening is the president delegates most of that responsibility to the executive agencies. Again, think about things like Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, Environmental Protection Agency, the IRS. These are all examples of administrative agencies that carry out the desires of the president. Now, the president, of course, cannot pass law. Okay. Um, and as a consequence, you need to understand that really what the executive branch is there to do is to enforce the laws which have been passed by Congress. All right, that's a huge limitation. Okay, that being said, um, they do have a lot of power. All right, in throughout the government, and to be fair, the powers of the presidency have gone up dramatically, really, since the 1960s and 1970s, certainly since FDR in the 1930s and 40s under the New Deal. What does the president do? Well, loosely, they enforce laws and policies. They can propose laws and veto legislation, and proposing laws has become much, much, much more important recently. They can appoint federal judges and justices of the Supreme Court. So they do have a role in the judicial process, too. And it's up to the executive branch to negotiate all the treaties the United States signs. Now, Congress has to approve those treaties, but Congress doesn't negotiate those. All right. Let's go over really quickly how the president is essentially elected. Hopefully, you are aware that the president serves a 4-year term, and there is a 2-term limit. Now, those terms do not have to be consecutive. They can be, but they don't have to be. All right. So, how is the president elected? Well, the president has to win a majority of the electoral college votes. All right. So they have to get 51%. That's 235 ish electoral votes that are necessary out of 38 electoral votes. They need to win 51%. That's important. Why? Because this, to an extent, is why we have a two-party system. It's very, very difficult for third parties to ever conceivably get to that 51%. And that's why, by and large, we don't have them. What it also means is there has been a number of times throughout American history where one of two things has happened. Either a candidate doesn't get 51%, in which case the vote goes to the House of Representatives in a process I'll discuss in more detail later, or I've had the other thing that's happened, which is a president, because they're not elected by the popular vote, that's the total number of vote cast. You could have a president who wins the presidency, becomes president via the Electoral College, but does not win the popular vote. That's happened multiple times in American history. And that's because of a quirk in our system. You could win Texas by 2 votes, 2 total votes, and you get all 40 electoral votes. But you could lose a state like California by a million vote, and you don't get any of them. But you still got 40 and your opponent got 54, even though you only won by 2 in Texas and they won by a million in California. Didn't matter. So that's how you can see very quickly how we can wind up with some of these, I'll say, offsetting issues. Now, there's also a series of checks and balances placed on the executive branch and by the executive branch. Congress creates laws, the president can't, and controls funding to an extent. Now, there's an asterisk by that now because things are seemingly developing in a different direction. But in general, it's up to Congress to create law and control funding. The president can't do that. The executive can't do that. The Supreme Court can decide if something is constitutional or not. The executive can't do that. And then, of course, there's what we call the other powers. We've got the media, which provides oversight onto all of our branches of government and watches to make sure that things are taken in place. Now, the president wears a lot of different hats. Crucially, they're the political leader of their party. They are the policy setter. They are the commander in chief. They are the keeper of the economy. And they are our number one, what we call head of state, which means they provide ceremonial functions anytime a foreign dignitary comes. The president meets with them, generally speaking. That's different compared to a country like Great Britain, where you have a head of state, which is King Charles at this point, and then you have a head of government. That's their prime minister. All right. So that's the difference between the United States government, where those roles are fused, and in ours. We'll be going into a lot of these topics in a lot greater detail later on, but that's your basic overview of the executive branch.